Well, I think it certainly wasn't a prelude to a wider war. I think it's probably a bit early to say it's an off-ramp. It seems to me that what Israel achieved was that elusive point, being tough enough for at least the mainstream Israeli political market, but restrained enough so that it hasn't triggered off an Iranian response. Tough, why? Because they fired missiles, clearly, they haven't avowed it, but they did, into Iran, not just into Iran, but into Isfahan area, which is where Iran has its nuclear weapon facilities. So a very clear warning to Iran that Israel has the capacity to do huge damage if it chose to, but restrained because these missiles, or whatever they were, seemed to land outside urban areas, no reports of civilian casualties, low key, and because Israel hasn't avowed it, it's allowed Iran to say nothing to see here, move on. So far, so good, but it's still a very volatile region. It's possible that Hezbollah might have a go at Israel across the northern border. So I wouldn't yet say we're out of the woods, but this was a move in the direction of de-escalation rather than the reverse.
And an Iranian official has indicated there's no immediate plan for retaliation to the attacks. Is that where you think it will stand?
Well, I think it will stand there for the moment, until the next thing happens, wherever that may be. I think we have to bear in mind that this exchange has crossed a red line. Now Israel has attacked Iranian territory, Iran has attacked Israeli territory. That's a precedent that's been set in case of future escalation of one kind or another. But right now, I think both sides have decided to leave it there. It does create, as was being said earlier, an enormous opportunity for Israel to turn back to the Gaza problem and to try to move quickly to a ceasefire, exchange hostage release, humanitarian aid increasing into Gaza, and then really begin to harvest some of the benefits of the last week, which partly has been moderate Arabs being willing to stand with Israel and help defend Israel last Saturday night against an Iranian attack. There's a potential gain there for Israel.
But will Netanyahu be allowed to take that gain by his right wing? I mean, you look at the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, describing the attacks today as feeble on Twitter.
Yeah, that's his problem. In one ear, he's got President Biden, the British, the entire Western community saying, for heaven's sake, restrain, calm it down, dial it down. In the other ear, he's got the right wing, very right wing members of his war cabinet saying the opposite. I haven't heard so much from the generals, from people like Benny Gantz, former IDF commander, who's also in the war cabinet. So it sounds to me like probably the military thought the Iranians will very well understand this signal. It may have looked feeble to one or two of the politicians, and the Iranians may be denying it in public. They know precisely what happened and the implications of that in terms of how at risk their nuclear facilities are. They don't have the kind of air defenses Israel has.
Well, let's zoom in on that nuclear point, and the symbolism of that attack on Isfahan, because the Times reported today that Iranian Revolutionary Guards commander in charge of nuclear security warned that the country could reconsider its nuclear security. I mean, how close is Iran to being capable of using its stock of enriched uranium to make nuclear bombs?
I mean, we've been saying for years, perhaps decades, that Iran was only a short way away from completing the work needed to produce a nuclear weapon. The sanctions that we put on Iran, the effort to talk to Iran about that went on under Barack Obama's presidency, fell away when Trump pulled out of it. And they've clearly got even closer. I don't know what the latest classified assessments are, but they clearly could now move pretty quickly to having some sort of nuclear device. That was clearly what was being hinted at, but whether that's the usual kind of flesh creeping that goes on, I don't know. It certainly reminds everyone that the Iranian nuclear program is there. It's quite well advanced, and it could be pushed through to the point where they actually had a weapon.
I mean, is that what Iran's foreign minister was hinting at when he said that if Israel strikes again, Iran would respond at a maximum level, the implication being that the 300 missiles and drones fired at Israel were the kind of bare minimum?
I don't think that was threatening nuclear use, because I don't think they've got a usable nuclear weapon. I think that meant that attack last Saturday night, we telegraphed it in advance. We let people know it was coming, and therefore that huge air defense operation was mobilized with several countries involved. I think what I interpret that to mean is, we could strike out of the blue with no notice, more powerfully, and more determinedly to get through at least some missiles through the Israeli air defense system. So I think it was a warning that what happened last Saturday night, although it was dangerous and it was a show of force, it wasn't the maximum that we can do, and we could do more that would increase the risk of serious damage in Israel.
You've talked about this delicate balance that Israel had to make with this attack. Do you think the fact that they did balance it in the way that they did suggests that they are listening to calls for international calls for restraint? Because it has seemed in the last few days that they've been sort of oblivious to those concerns internationally.
Well, it is interesting, and I think I do agree on that. I mean, certainly they've been pretty oblivious to calls to dial it down in Gaza. 6 months now, where the gap between the Americans and the Israelis have opened wider and wider. Enormous pressure on Israel, which they haven't really responded to. In this case, yes, I think they probably did listen. I think they realized that they need the Americans, and they would need them more and more if they came under a sustained Iranian attack. And they had to take some account of what President Biden was saying. And I suspect also large parts of Israeli opinion didn't want to find themselves pitchforked into an all-out war with Iran. They wanted an Iranian response to last Saturday night's events, but not something that triggered off further rounds of retaliation. So I think it was a good judgment call. I think the Israelis have, for the moment, found that elusive spot between being too tough and too restrained. And let's just hope that this rather fragile sense of de-escalation holds.
Lord Ricketts, thanks very much for your time this afternoon.
Iran has said it is not planning an immediate retaliation after a reported Israeli missile strike on its territory. Tehran has dismissed the incident as a failed attack, while Israel is not officially commented. We can speak to our reporter there now. Gabrielle Weiniger joins us. Hi, Gabrielle.
Hello.
So, first of all, what do we know about the attack? What were the targets? Was it successful on its own terms?
Well, we need to define success when we ask a question like that. What we do know is that allegedly Israel targeted a military installation. It's thought to be some kind of airbase that houses Iran's fighter jets, which is quite an interesting parallel, as we know that Iran sent hundreds of drones into Israel and targeted their air base, which housed their fighter jets last week in an unprecedented attack on Israeli soil. Reportedly, there were 3 explosions. What is interesting about this site is it's in Isfahan, and it's supposed to be near one of Iran's nuclear uranium enrichment programs, where that's housed, some of their nuclear facilities there. So I think in terms of success, if Israel was looking for a retaliation that wouldn't spark an escalation, that's certainly, hopefully, been achieved. And with Iran saying, in fact, nothing happened and this attack was thwarted, it looks like Iran also wants to de-escalate tensions. So Israel could have placated its more right-wing base, especially within the government, by saying we have, in fact, responded, but at the same time avoided any further deterioration.
And it's interesting. So it's an odd thing when you think, well, actually firing missiles is a sign of trying to dial things down a bit. But the point is that Israel targeted Iran's embassy, which prompted the attack by Iran on Israel at the weekend. 300 missiles and drones, but ultimately no life lost, no major damage. Iran then feels obliged to respond in some way, but in the smallest possible, we've done something, but we're not actually trying to escalate this. Is that it now? Do you think, do we draw a line under it?
It's hard to say. It looks like that might be the case. Israel will want to avoid any fallout, especially during the festival of Passover, which is happening at the moment. It's going to start on Monday. And that's quite an interesting thing to look at when you think about religious festivals dictating policy. But this is the Middle East, and there are many, many religious elements within the Israeli government who won't want regional fallout at this time. They want, as much as possible, a quiet Passover. So I think that, in a way, they might have at least tried to put this to bed in some way. Attacking Iranian facilities, military bases, is not necessarily a new thing. It's a very long-running tactic in this long shadow war that's been going on between Iran and Israel. What was unprecedented, of course, was the Iranian strike, and what was unprecedented was the Israeli strike on April the 1st on de facto Iranian soil, on an Iranian embassy in Syria. So what might have happened last night might not warrant a retaliation.
And then presumably attention returning to what has been happening in Gaza and the international pressure that was building a couple of weeks ago on Benjamin Netanyahu to scale back potentially the Israel attacks on Gaza. What is the situation there? And is there a sense that international pressure is getting purchase on him?
I think that's a really good point. I think in a way, Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, has bought some credibility and some time and potentially an orange light. If he was on a red light when it came to invading Rafah, which is, of course, home to over 1 million displaced Palestinians who have been displaced from all across Gaza over 7 months of war, it was something the international community warned very strongly against. And he might have bought some kind of go-ahead for that. The US has denied reports that was part of a negotiation with or some kind of leeway in not retaliating in a strong way against Iran. But it seems likely that might be that Netanyahu that's his card. That's what he wants to play. And the attention will be focused back on Gaza because, of course, the international community has been looking a completely different way.
Yeah.
And they might have been preparing for this. Once they evacuate civilians, which is something they said and they've promised America that they will do, it's very, very likely that operation will go ahead after Passover. And with negotiations, indirect negotiations with Hamas for any kind of ceasefire, return of hostages, return of civilians to the north of the Gaza Strip at a complete standstill, that does look like that might be the likely next move for Israel.
Right, the media, understandably, I guess, uncertain about what the implications of an Israeli strike would be, or precisely what the Israelis were going to do or did. The tone of the media is that we're on the cusp of World War III, or at least a regional war. And I cautioned then that we would have. It's really wrong to worst case all of this. And the truth is what we witnessed April 13, 14, and again last night was a series of signaling and messaging from Iran to Israel and now Israel to Iran that in effect there would be a price, a cost, if in fact one or both attack the other. And the reality is, I think, we've dodged a bullet during this phase, but I'm reminded of the joke about the man who jumps off a 10-story building and he's passing the 5th floor. Somebody yells out, "Well, how are you doing?" And he responds, "So far, so good." None of the underlying issues that drive the strategic rivalry between Israel and Iran are being resolved or will be resolved. The issue of proxies, what to do about Iran's putative quest, perhaps, to become not just a nuclear weapons threshold state, but a nuclear weapons state, and the regional competition. I think that the unanswered question, final point, is whether or not what we've seen will reinforce risk aversion on the part of Iran and Israel now that you've crossed this threshold of attacking one another's territory, or will it inspire or accelerate risk readiness? We don't know the answer.
Right. So what's the best way for us all to sort of de-escalate this situation now and deal with some of those issues you just raised?
There is no. We're in a strategic cul-de-sac when it comes to the Iranian Israeli problem and, frankly, the U.S. Iranian problem. The U.S. has a strategic problem with the Islamic Republic. It does not have a strategic solution. Everything it does, whether it's the Iranian nuclear agreement, trying to reach sustainable understandings to avoid escalation, all of this is transaction. There's no transformation, in large part because you have a regime that's heavily ideological and uses hatred and anger of the U.S. To mobilize, to distract, and to export its ideology. And the fact that the Iranians are now involved in what you might call a strategic alliance with Vladimir Putin's Russia, particularly on the issue of drones and sharing their expertise, means that Iran is even broadening its reach in an effort to oppose what America, NATO, and much of the West stands for. So I see no solution. It's all about management. It's all about containment.
Mm. And if that's the case, there have been so many international calls for restraint. You could argue, as the last guest I had on this story did, that those calls have in some way been heard by Israel. But equally, you seem to be suggesting that the US is sort of powerless to do very much about this situation.
Well, I'm not sure that's a radical or drastic conclusion. I mean, you've watched another strategic cul-de-sac, Israel and Hamas in Gaza, for the last 6 months. And I think what both of these conflicts demonstrate, particularly when parties believe that the stakes involved in their conflict are existential, the outside influence of great powers, middle-sized powers, international organizations, quite limited. The Middle East is littered, literally. Britain understands this, perhaps as an imperial power, better than anyone. The Middle East is littered with the remains of great powers who wrongly believe they can impose their will, their schemes, their dreams, their aspirations and ambitions on small ones.
And
this shouldn't come as a shock.
I suppose the problem is that, you talk to people out and about, friends, colleagues and so on, and they feel a kind of sense of, irrelevance and powerlessness in the face of potential World War III. I know you talk about the media talking that up, but, people are scared and they feel that there is absolutely nothing that anyone can do to bring us back from the brink. That's the reality, isn't it?
I think, and it doesn't only apply to this broken, angry, dysfunctional region, the Middle East. I mean, it applies to Sudan. It applies to Syria. It applies to Myanmar. It applies to most of the conflicts that have occurred or are occurring. The limits of international organization. Look at mass killing. I mean, where do you want to start? The Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, Syria, Myanmar, the Uyghurs. I mean, the international community, basically, it's a whole nother discussion, has failed to intercede to stop mass killing, let alone genocide. It's the exception. Bosnia, perhaps.
But I suppose in the past, in sort of huge crises, there has been political leadership somewhere in the world that has been sort of impressive, that people can place their faith in. That doesn't seem to be the case now.
It's true, because I think the world, in many respects, is less dangerous, but it's much more complicated. The era of great power, I mean, we have great power competition, but you have the United States essentially in a global competition with Russia and China. You have middle-sized powers, Iran, North Korea, that are able to project their influence abroad and to oppose NATO, to impose American power. So again, I think fewer conflicts in the world today, more people being fed, technology being used, but a much more complicated world, and one in which I think it's extremely difficult for powers like the United States or the United States to basically fashion or diffuse these conflicts. And part of it's our own domestic dysfunction, for sure. I might add, having worked for Democrats and Republicans and voted for Democrats and Republicans, should the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party return to the presidency, you're going to see even more dysfunction, more limitations, self-imposed on what America is prepared and or willing to do in terms of multilateral alliances, NATO, and positive intervention in order to at least try to contain some of these problems. So, it's a very unhappy situation. We dodged a bullet over the last 24 hours. The question is whether or not we can continue to contain this, because resolving it strikes me as right now fanciful.
Not surprising at all that Iran has downplayed the attack last night, and we have to hope that Israel will leave it at that and hasn't got other measures up its sleeve to rub home the message which it has sent by the attack last night. Of course, that attack hasn't changed either the strategic or the tactical situation. Iran knew that its facilities were within reach of Israeli action. There is a message from Israel: we're not afraid to attack your own territory, in the way that you were not afraid to attack our Israeli territory. But that is about as far as it goes so far.
US officials have confirmed that Israel carried out airstrikes against Iran in the early hours of Friday. Israel has yet to issue a statement on the incident, while Tehran has so far downplayed the scale of the attack, saying it has no immediate plans for retaliation. Here's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak speaking earlier.
The situation overnight, as you would appreciate, it's a developing situation. It wouldn't be right for me to speculate until the facts become clear, and we're working to confirm the details together with allies. We have condemned Iran's reckless and dangerous barrage of missiles against Israel on Saturday, and Israel absolutely has the right to self-defense. But as I said to Prime Minister Netanyahu when I spoke to him last week, and more generally, significant escalation is not in anyone's interest. What we want to see is calm heads prevail across the region.
Well, is this a sign that we're inching closer to a full-blown regional conflict? Well, we can speak now to Sir Richard Dalton, who's a former UK ambassador to Iran. Sir Richard, thank you for joining us on the programme this afternoon.
Good morning.
In terms of what we know, we have had confirmation from America of this attack, but both Israel and Iran are staying pretty tight-lipped. So do we have any sense of the scale of it?
Something definitely happened, but it was clearly a pretty small affair. We don't know whether it was a missile or drones. If it was just drones, clearly the explosive capability of a quadcopter, which has been mentioned, is pretty limited. It could be that in the next few days, news of significant damage will leak out. But one very important indicator came from the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has staff on the ground in Iran monitoring Iranian facilities. And he said that no Iranian facilities connected with their civil nuclear program were attacked.
In terms of Iran's sort of sphere of influence, there has been a lot spoken about since those October the 7th attacks and what's been going on in terms of the operations in Gaza, of the kind of malign influence that Iran has in the region, of how it sponsors proxies in the region, of what its involvement may have been on the October the 7th attacks itself. Is it surprising then that the official word from Tehran is that they're not planning any retaliation to this? Because everything leading up to this point, the international community's supposition has been that it's in Iran's interest for this to escalate.
No, I don't think anybody has been thinking that it's in Iran's interest. They've taken their cue from sound analysis that Iran is not in a strong position to wage a conventional war and has not sought to egg on Hezbollah. It has not sought to enter the conflict in Gaza. For a while, it permitted, it encouraged pinprick attacks, particularly on American facilities by its allies in Iraq and Syria. But at this stage, it's not surprising at all that Iran has downplayed the attack last night. And we have to hope that Israel will leave it at that and hasn't got other measures up its sleeve to rub home the message which it has sent by the attack last night. Of course, that attack hasn't changed either the strategic or the tactical situation. Iran knew that its facilities were within reach of Israeli action. There is a message from Israel: we're not afraid to attack your own territory, in the way that you were not afraid to attack our Israeli territory. But that is about as far as it goes so far.
So sorry, in terms of my original question then, so are you suggesting that Iran has been a good faith actor throughout all of this and it hasn't been working with proxies? I'm just trying to be clear.
No, I'm not suggesting that. They have been. I told you that they had supported and encouraged their allies to attack the United States, but they have, with Hezbollah, not been keen on opening a significant front against Israel, which they have the capability of doing. It's important to step back and look at the region as a whole, which is roiled by civil war and conflict, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and to look at who's actually involved across their borders. Yes, Iran is, and you can stigmatize that as destabilizing if you wish, but also one should think about the destabilizing effect of Israeli actions, particularly in the West Bank, in seizing more land, in killing, in arresting, in provoking Palestinian population there by continuing its apartheid-like activities. You also would want to refer to Turkish actions in northern Iraq against Kurds. You cast your mind back to the Saudi UAE invasion of Yemen, which caused immense loss and suffering and exacerbated the civil war there. You might even point to United States assistance to Israel, which, in spite of United States reticence and caution about what Israel is doing in Gaza, continues unabated. So there are a lot of destabilizing actors at work, and these conflicts have to be settled one at a time, starting with Gaza, which is the most acute source of instability at present.
It's not a win to remain alive. When particularly Israel worries about the existential threat of an Iranian nuclear weapons program, I think that should be a major factor in their decision to retaliate. At a minimum, what happened on Saturday was the failure of deterrence. And so the first question for Israel is how to restore deterrence. I don't believe you restore it with a group of medieval religious fanatics ruling a country like Iran by proportional response, tit for tat. It simply says to them, we know exactly what the response will be if we were to do it again. You reestablish deterrence by disproportionate force. Make it clear to the adversary that if they ever try anything like that again, they will suffer far more than any cost they impose on Israel, meaning if they're sensible, if they have any kind of logic comparable to ours, they won't risk it again. And that's what Israel should be aiming at.
And Iran has preempted Israel's response by threatening that even the tiniest invasion of its territory would bring a massive and harsh response, and that if Iran had wanted to carry out a bigger attack on Saturday, it would have done, and nothing would have remained of the Zionist regime. What do you think their intention was?
Well, I think that kind of rhetoric derives from Kim Jong-un's playbook in North Korea. He routinely announces he's going to unleash a sea of fire across the Korean peninsula if anybody looks at him cross-eyed. This is from a regime that says it doesn't want nuclear weapons, that it's not pursuing them covertly, and yet it's using that kind of language. That's the language of a regime that, unfortunately, for all concerned, its people, Israel's people, the rest of the world, unfortunately, only respects force. The way to demonstrate that force is right at hand now with a very strong Israeli response. Is there risk in a strong Israeli response? Of course. But there's graver risk, I think, in not responding, given Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons.
But what do you think Iran's intention was?
Well, we know that this was an unprecedented effort by Iran to attack another country. They've never done anything quite like this before. They used cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones. So it was trying to show their overall capability. I don't think this was a kabuki theater exercise. I think they expected to inflict significant damage. And one fact that hasn't gotten much attention, which I think is important, reported by the Wall Street Journal on Saturday and by CBS reporting separately on Wednesday, informed by American sources that of the 120 ballistic missiles that Iran launched out of the total of 320 projectiles Saturday night, of the 120 ballistic missiles, half blew up on the launch pad or crashed to earth before they got close enough to Israel to shoot down. Now, if that's correct, a failure rate of 50% of their ballistic missiles tells us something about their capabilities. you don't play act at going after Israel when you're going to be embarrassed by the fact that half your ballistic missiles were junk. So I think it demonstrates the seriousness of Iran's intention and the weakness of their ballistic missile arsenal.
The US and the UK are all about not escalating, but is the risk of a greater regional war a risk you simply have to take at this moment?
Israel's in a regional war. That's what the Ring of Fire strategy is. And obviously, decision makers have to calibrate risk against a reward here. What do they expect to get? What do they fear might happen later? There is a risk in retaliating. Nobody can deny that. There's also a risk in not retaliating, in saying to Iran that, in effect, Israel is intimidated by Iran or has succumbed to U.S. pressure. This goes to one of the most important and least well-known things Winston Churchill ever said, when he talked about the confirmed unteachability of mankind, of our unwillingness to act when the cost of action is minimal, only to face the problem down the road where you have to act and the cost and the risks are much higher. I come back again to the Iranian nuclear weapons program. No one in Israel can have any faith that the next time they see incoming ballistic missiles from Iran, they may have nuclear warheads under their nose cones.
Iran was retaliating, it says, to the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate building in Syria. Do you think that attack was justified?
Well, it took out several senior Quds Force officials who are the people responsible for Iraq and Syria who have been transporting Iranian drones and missiles across Iraq and Syria into Lebanon to go into Hezbollah's arsenal. They were directing part of the Ring of Fire strategy. That entitles Israel to go after them. They are combatants. It's true they were apparently in a consulate, but that doesn't shield them as they're carrying on military activity. You can go into a church or you can go into an office building and put a cross on the front door. That doesn't mean it's a religious facility. It's being used for military purposes. Well, I think Iran could be a nuclear threat within about 72 hours if it simply wires the appropriate amount of purchase money to the central bank of North Korea and Pyongyang and get a couple warheads loaded on transports that would fly across China and deliver them to Iran. Look, we're facing a new axis that's in the process of formation. It's not completely done yet, but the Beijing-Moscow axis is real. It's got its outliers like North Korea and Iran and Syria, Belarus, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. They're all on the same side. Iranian drones are being used by Russia in Ukraine right now. And I think the weakness the West has displayed, the ineffectiveness we've displayed in Ukraine, very visible in Moscow, very visible in Beijing, and in all the capitals that we fear. So we either get our act together again and face this challenge, or we're just going to see Ukraine and the war in the Middle East repeated elsewhere, in Asia in particular, where I'm now worried.
What do you think is at stake here in terms of the way it reacts? How can this determine the future in terms of the stability of the Middle East and the way Iran will proceed?
The question is whether Israel wants to manage the problem of Iran or wants to try and solve the problem of Iran. I'd say it's sort of an American way of thinking that we don't manage problems, we solve them. The biggest threat to peace and security in the Middle East today is Iran, its nuclear program and its support for terrorism. Israel is the principal target. It's the little Satan that Iran talks about and whose nuclear program is, I think, devoted to destroying Israel. If Israel acts dispositively here, it will do itself and the world a favor. I don't know what the Israeli decision is, but I think the United States should support this, one of its strongest allies, as it acts against an existential threat posed by Iran.
Iron Dome is one component of a layered missile defense that Israel operates. It's the lowest down, the last line of defense, as it were. There are two other components plus some outside assistance. The other components are the Arrow missiles, which are there to intercept the long-range ballistic missiles that are coming in from quite high up in the atmosphere. It's not clear if this operated against the Iranian attack. The mid layer is called David's Sling, and it's against more intermediate range threats. This is clearly what did a lot of the work in the attacks over the weekend. The Iron Dome is the last layer, and it's site-specific. It's around Israeli population centers and military facilities. There are a number of Iron Dome sites around Israel, and it would have participated in shooting down the incoming drones and missiles in the last stages of their flight. In addition, there were also aircraft of the Israeli Air Force that were active in shooting down particularly drones that could be quite effective in this role, and assets from the U.S. Navy, both ships with anti-missile capabilities and aircraft with anti-drone capabilities that were involved in some measure in the weekend's activity.
It's believed that the Iron Dome, it's consistently blocked more than 90% of rockets fired towards Israel. What's the technology behind that makes it so effective?
It's a system of radar that detects incoming objects, missiles and drones and things like that, that is connected to short-range batteries of anti-missile missiles. There are a number of different technologies that are in use. Some impact on the incoming missiles, some explode in the area and try to destroy it with the explosion.
When we look at the Iron Dome and as Israel's defense strategy, do you think that that's had an influence on enemy states and how they conduct their warfare? You know, some might be quite surprised that Iran launched all these airstrikes knowing that this Iron Dome has been so effective at countering them.
The important thing to consider is why Israel missile defenses, in particular Iron Dome, were created. And this is because about 20 years or so ago, there was a direct threat to Israel from rather primitive, unguided ballistic systems used by Hezbollah and Hamas to strike Israel. These were weapons of terror. They did not have the accuracy to target military installations specifically. So the primary threat was to Israeli civilians. So to protect its population, Israel developed its missile defense systems, including Iron Dome. And in this era, they have proved to be fairly effective in stopping incoming threats. In the most recent case, Iran chose to attack Israel with its ballistic missiles and drones, many of which are a higher degree of accuracy than the original things that Iron Dome was designed to protect against. But Iron Dome is still effective against most short-range and medium-range missile and drone threats. Iran likely decided on this option because this is a capability that it had. There is no proximity between Iran and Israel, and so this was a way to strike Israel from a distance. It's also a mathematical calculation. When you think about missile defense, it's the defending things, the interceptors, are much more expensive than the incoming ballistic missiles. So it's possible in the economic sense to overwhelm defenses. And you saw that happen because a few of the missiles did get through. A very small number. So I think it should be accounted as a success for Israeli missile defense. But nevertheless, there were still some things that were able to get through it. There is a significant difference in types of missile defenses based on what is coming in and what you're trying to defend against. And the defense against the sort of low-tech, early generation ballistic missiles that Iran has fired at Israel is of an order of magnitude easier than defending against longer range, much faster moving ballistic missiles.
So in the case of Jordan, there are reports that Jordanian aircraft shot down dozens of Iranian munitions over Jordanian airspace. Of course, the United States did the same with its suite of air defense systems in the Middle East. And there are reports that the British, as well as the French, also assisted in the air defense of Israel.
And just to go back to that comparison with what we're seeing in Ukraine and with Russia, the specific tactics were quite similar as well, weren't they, in terms of trying to overwhelm the air defenses?
Yeah, right. No, exactly. And I think part of why that is because the Iranians are looking at the Russian use of the Shahed drone, for example, as well as the Russian ballistic and cruise missiles against Ukraine and drawing lessons from that. So if you look at the structure of this strike package, the composition, the number of drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles, as well as how they were timed to enter Israeli airspace, there are a lot of similarities with how the Russians conduct these attacks in Ukraine. So, of course, there are hundreds of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones that were launched in this attack, but they were launched in waves. So they were timed so that as the drones and cruise missiles began to enter Israeli airspace, they would distract the Israeli air defenses and the ballistic missiles would actually get through. So as you're looking at this strike package, the ballistic missiles are the component that Iran believed would strike home. And this is really important because that's how Russia structures a lot of its strike packages as well. But if you look at the comparison between Ukraine's success in intercepting drones and missiles the ballistic missiles specifically, compare that with Israel's success, it's night and day. So the Ukrainians average about a 16% intercept rate on ballistic missiles. The Israeli intercept rate on Saturday was over 90%. So while the Iranians were learning this lesson from the Russians in Ukraine, they probably calculated that, yes, the Israeli air defenses are going to be more successful than Ukraine's, but I doubt that they expected that Israel's air defense structure would be just as effective as it actually ended up being. Again, this goes home and really drives home the point about Ukraine and some of the systems that of course, the Ukrainians need in their fight.
Surely also one of the other key differences is that Israel was pretty much as prepared for this attack as you can be through intelligence briefings, through some pretty overt warnings from Iran.
Sure, although I don't think that the warnings are necessarily as important as they're being drawn out to be, in fact. I say that because there are a couple things on the Israeli side for context that need to be kept in mind. The first, Israel is already on a war footing. It's taking rocket fire, drone fire across its borders nearly every day. Its air defenses are already on high alert. Iran's warnings aren't really going to change that. Of course, it takes Israel faces ballistic missile and cruise missile fire from the Houthis as well on a pretty regular basis. Now, I think in terms of the Iranian telegraphing, it tried to create a tactical surprise by injecting uncertainty on when the strike would actually occur. But the Israelis were prepared. The Israelis knew that there would probably be some strike coming, given that they killed such a high-level IRGC commander on April 1st. But also, like I said, they're on a war footing. And so I don't think the telegraphing of this attack, the warning of this attack, is actually as important to its success, to the air defense success, as some are putting out.
You mentioned the original Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Let's just rewind to there. What do you think Israel's motivation was with that strike?
Sure. So the commander that they killed was a very high-level IRGC officer. He led the IRGC effort across Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And he was actually one of the only non-Lebanese members of the Lebanese Hezbollah Shura Council and its Jihad Council, which is really important. It shows the role that individual played in Lebanese Hezbollah. Now, of course, I think one of the important items for us to keep in mind is how Iran is using Syria rather to bring in weapons in other systems to Lebanese Hezbollah. Israel has been hitting these shipments as they come through Syria for months now, and of course, the strike on April 1st was part of this effort as well to degrade Iran's ability to support its partner in Lebanon, Lebanese Hezbollah.
Just on that, I was speaking on Frontline only last week to Roger Boyes, who's the Times diplomatic editor, and he made a very good point, which is that, of course, Russia essentially controls Syrian airspace. So why would it allow Israel to carry out this attack?
I'm not sure. It depends on what exactly which capabilities the Israelis used. In this case, I would be very surprised if the Israelis did not use the F-35, which is, of course, a stealth aircraft. In that case, there's a very good chance that Syria and Russia were not even necessarily aware that there were Israeli aircraft in the sky until the bombs were already falling.
And so in terms of the response we've seen from Iran, I mean, they had a number of options. Some people speculated they may attack a consulate and embassy of Israel, almost a kind of tit-for-tat response. Why do you think they chose to launch an attack on Israel itself? And how do you think it will be viewed in Iran, given that really it didn't have much effect in terms of damage?
Yeah, I think that the Iranians were trying to make a successful attack that they hoped would deter Israel from further attacks on their commanders overseas, advising their proxy and partner network in the axis of resistance. Of course, I don't think that theory is actually going to work. We're already seeing reports that Israel will retaliate against Iran for these attacks. Now, how it's going to play domestically, I'm not entirely sure. I think that in a lot of ways, it's actually more important for the Iranians to play this attack to its foreign audience. By its foreign audience, I'm actually referring to its partners in the axis of resistance, so the Iranian-backed militias throughout the region. It's important for Iran to kind of demonstrate its Islamic resistance laurels against Israel in this way, especially in the wake of such a big attack, such as the one on April 1st in Damascus.
We're trying to say to our friends in the region, Israel in this case in particular, look, let's see if there's a way to de-escalate this whilst also respecting their right to defend their own soil, particularly from a country that wants to erase it.
The risk of escalation of the conflict between Israel and Iran is currently looking worryingly high. Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel would make its own decisions after Lord Cameron suggested Israel's response to Iran's attack at the weekend should be smart and limited. Iran, in turn, promised a massive and harsh response if Israel attacks its territory. The Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
How worried are you, Grant Shapps, about what Israel might do next? Cameron went to Israel to make the case for de-escalation. It doesn't seem that case is being heeded.
I'm worried, extremely worried about the kind of overall picture, and that goes beyond what Israel will do next. I mean, what Iran did on Saturday, firing 300 UAVs, so drones, and cruise and ballistic missiles at a democratic country is extremely concerning. And of course, there's potential for this to spiral into a much broader regional war. And so, of course, we are stressing the need to be as careful as possible in response, but we also understand that Israel has a right to defend herself, given she's come under attack from an autocratic country, a theocracy, who wants to wipe Israel off the face of the planet.
But
so
does Netanyahu strike you as careful in this respect? He doesn't strike many people as careful in this respect.
No, I mean, look, I think there's a difference between a country and their democracy, and whether you think everything that an individual leader does is the right thing. And I think we have to be sort of clear-eyed about this. That when a democracy is under attack, the right to defend itself, and indeed have partners assist in that defence, should be second to none. Now, Iran doesn't have any of those controls. They're an autocracy. But of course, we're trying to say to our friends in the region, Israel in this case in particular, look, let's see if there's a way to de-escalate this whilst also respecting their right to defend their own soil, particularly from a country that wants to erase it.
54 Tory MPs have written to the Times today urging your government to prescribe the IRGC. I know this was off the table at the beginning of the week. Is it something you might still consider? Is there something Iran could do that might put this back on the table?
Well, I should say we always do keep under very close review the prescription of any organisation, terrorists in particular, of course. But we have actually already sanctioned lots of different elements. And in fact, the whole of the IRGC, the Iranian Guard, in full. So they are already all tightly sanctioned. There are pros and cons of proscription. One of the things you don't get to do if you prescribe is to have any form of diplomatic relations at all, which means you can no longer deliver direct messages. You can no longer have an embassy. So there are things to balance off in both directions. Ultimately, the decision actually that the Home Secretary takes. But I think this is constantly under review, and the position at the moment is that they remain with diplomatic relations in place, which has enabled, for example, the Foreign Secretary to have direct conversations with their Foreign Secretary.
Do you think it's acceptable, Grant Shapps? We had 100 visas to be granted to Iranian clerics. These are people loyal to the Iranian theocratic regime. They come to Britain. By very definition, they are loyal to a regime that is harmful towards us. What checks are on Iranian clerics coming into this country on religious visas that they don't wish ill towards us?
Yeah, I mean, look, I do worry about the potential for, because we're an open democratic state. There is always that concern about the potential for people to abuse our sort of liberal nature as a country, as a democracy. But that is why we've done a whole bunch of different things, including updating our espionage laws, overhauling the way that we tackle extremism. And again, that's something that Michael Gove's done as community
But will you look into these Iranian clerics? Will you keep an eye on Iranian clerics coming into this country?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a subject of detailed discussion amongst ministers, because we are very concerned to make sure that our good nature isn't essentially abused, and our belief in free speech isn't abused by those who want to do harm to this country. So very much so.
Grant Shapps, people who listen to this programme know what a supporter you are of Ukraine. And I wonder whether you might offer some thoughts in this subject, which has exercised us this week. Why is the UK able to help Israel with planes in the air, shooting down missiles that might harm people in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but they are not able to do that to stop missiles coming from Russia that might harm people in Kyiv?
Well, we most certainly do help. This is the first thing to say.
And we understand that. We understand that you do help in lots of ways, but you are not willing. The country has not been willing to send planes in the air to tackle missiles. And we've had Ukrainians on this show not understanding why. And what's the reason?
So let me just run through it. First of all, we do actually help. We do help with that defence. We do help with that missile defence by giving those things to Ukraine. And the United Kingdom has been first amongst all with our forward willingness to do that. And that's something that President Zelensky has made very clear to me. In fact, even saying he's not sure they would be in the war at all if it weren't for Britain's actions. On the other hand, you asked the question, why do we fly jets in the case of Iran? The simple answer is we're flying those jets under an existing operation in Iraq or over Iraq and Syria between Iran and Israel. We were neither flying in Israeli airspace or in Iran's airspace. So you've got a different geographical setup. And of course, the last thing to say is what we don't want to see happen in Ukraine or elsewhere is to draw in a NATO situation where you're effectively creating a war between Russia and NATO directly. So the position in Ukraine is somewhat different to the position in the Middle East, but our determination to help, and I don't think anyone could doubt, not least because I've just made the biggest, with the Prime Minister, the biggest single package of donation to Ukraine this year at £2.5 billion. And so we are very much looking at, when we don't give that money to Israel, we don't give that money anywhere else. That money is going to Ukraine. So I don't think anyone can doubt our determination to help Ukraine.
The question is how much money you have to spend generally as Secretary of State for Defence. You've committed to increasing spending to 2.5%, but people want to know, Grant Shapps, when will that happen? Will that happen before an election? Let's say the election is in the autumn, just for the sake of argument. Can you say on this programme that there will be an increase of defence spending by the autumn?
I would love to write our, on next budgets, or spring statements or autumn statements on this programme, but I can't do that. But what I can do is say that we are committed, as you said, when the conditions allow economically, to that 2.5%.
So they're not allowed. So they're not right now. So as of April this year, it's not economically possible to increase defence spending to 2.5%.
So we keep this under constant review, and as soon as we can, we will. But in the meantime, we are, compared with last year, increasing our budget by 1.8% in real terms. So we're putting more cash in already, £56 billion plus this year to our total defense budget, including helping Ukraine. So this is the biggest cash amount ever. And we've said we want to go to 2.5%. We will, when we can, we will do that. But we have a very large, in fact, the second biggest in NATO defence budget. So we are not laggards on this.
Front page of the Times today, you will have read it. Mark Menzies under investigation after extraordinary claims. There are extraordinary claims about him using campaign funds to cover blackmail costs and medical bills. He called a 70-year-old volunteer at 3:15 in the morning to pay $6.5 grand from her savings account. I know he disputes this. This is a matter for investigation, which you're not going to be able to comment on. But the Conservative Party has known about this. They've known about this, Grant Shapps, since January. Why wasn't this acted upon in January?
So I'm afraid not over the detail of this as Defence Secretary, but I do know that further information came to light yesterday, and there was a conversation.
The Times reported it. The Times reported, but it is clear in the story. Senior Tories, including Simon Hart, have been aware of the allegations against Menzies since January. So this is a question of your party's competence in dealing with a problem.
Well, I was going to say, my understanding is, forgive me, I'm not close to the detail, but my understanding is that there was some further information yesterday. I don't know precisely what that was. It led to a conversation in which the whip was removed, and this would be properly investigated. As you note, the MP concerned, denies the allegations quite properly. There should be a proper investigation into it.
But that should have happened without the Times having to get involved. That's the question. The Times got involved, and the whip gets removed. This could have happened back. This could have happened back in January.
Well, as I say, I mean, I think it's proper that the process is followed. It sounds to me that there is potentially somebody who's quite troubled in the mix here. So I don't want to sort of go further commenting on something I don't have all the details.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right that a process is properly followed and this has got to the bottom of.
Just before you go, do you have to concede, Grant Shapps, that flights to Rwanda will not be going by spring? Spring is almost well and truly sprung. The flights are not going to be going to Rwanda in that time.
Well, look, I very much hope, because I think it's the only way to break this illegal people trafficking across the channel, that they can. I know.
You still hope they can. You still hope they can.
Well, if they don't, it will be entirely because Keir Starmer will not let his Lords vote for it or even stand down from voting against it. Labour have once again blocked the ability for Parliament to pass this law. Labour don't seem to have an answer. They don't seem to want it to happen. It's directly at Keir Starmer's door if they don't go.
And do you have any confidence that they will?
Well, I still think actually Parliament will. The Commons has spoken, and the Commons is the elected House. Very clearly, I'm very surprised that Keir Starmer still sent his Labour peers, the Lords, to go and defeat this once again. I don't think they can carry on doing that. Presumably next week that will be overturned. And I very much hope the flights can leave quickly, because I haven't heard a better alternative. I haven't heard the thing which is going to smash this illegal racketeering in people's lives and creating all this misery across the channel. I certainly haven't heard a solution from Labour, who simply criticise but don't have a solution and keep blocking, in this case last night in the Lords, through Labour peers, the Rwanda legislation.
Grant Shapps, thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you.
That's Grant Shapps there, the Defence Secretary. Concerned about Iranian clerics in this country. Not really wanting to get too much into Mark Menzies, who said he was quite a troubled individual.
There has to be a very substantial response on the territory of Iran, because what Iran did was attack Israel's territory from its own territory. That's as classic a definition of an act of war as you can get. And that the Israelis could look at a range of things, all of which I would find acceptable. Certainly the first thing they should do is flatten as much of Iran's air defense capabilities as they can to make sure more of their missiles get through and their pilots over Iran are safe. Second, they should destroy all of the bases that from which the attacks on Saturday night were launched, including any arsenals of drones and missiles that might be found at those bases. They could consider attacking headquarters of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and conventional military who ordered the attacks. I think they could consider destroying substantial parts of Iran's oil infrastructure. And I think whether they launch a kinetic attack against Iran's nuclear program, or perhaps just the mother of all cyber attacks against it, they should go after the nuclear program too.
John Bolton is the former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump and ambassador to the UN, and joins us now. John, good afternoon.
Glad to be with you.
Look, David Cameron is saying to Netanyahu, show restraint. Do you think he will?
Well, I don't know what the Israeli cabinet will do, but the first reaction of the UK and the US governments to Israel was to do nothing. Joe Biden said, "Take the win," because no one was killed in the Iranian attack, as if staying alive is a big victory. That's normally the way people live, is by staying alive. Our missile defense work did an excellent job, but staying alive doesn't constitute victory. So now both the Biden administration and your foreign secretary are saying, well, be restrained, and none of us want an escalation of the war. So is it and the Biden administration, I think I'm speaking equivalently here of the U.S. and the U.K. governments.
Mm-hmm.
Are they indifferent to who wins this conflict as long as it doesn't escalate? Would it be okay if there were no escalation, that Iran prevailed over Israel? I don't think they'd say yes to that. So what are they really talking about here? What the Israelis have been trying to do ever since October the 7th is not live under the threat of constant attack.
Mm.
And perhaps both UK and US governments have forgotten the ancient concept of victory.
I mean, when we talk about victory,
they don't attack you anymore.
I mean, Biden did say take the win. As far as he was concerned, that was a win, not just sort of from saying there was no loss of life, but from how effective Israel's response had been. It sounds as though
I
you
just
suggest,
cut in there because this is important. This is a very important point. Both the Wall Street Journal and CBS yesterday reported, citing U.S. official sources, that of the roughly 120 ballistic missiles that Iran launched, part of the 320 total projectiles that they launched, of the 120 ballistic missiles, half blew up on the launch pad or crashed before they got close enough to Israel to be engaged by the missile defenses. Now, just imagine that Iran's missile salvo actually delivered 120 ballistic missiles. That could have overwhelmed the missile defense capabilities that Israel, the UK, France, the US were providing. So
crucially,
before
though,
we
word,
say
John,
what a great win it is, let me just finish here, please. Before we say what a great win it is, let's acknowledge that some significant portion of the win was the junk that Iran puts in its ballistic missiles.
To be clear, it's Biden that's saying it was a win. It's not me. And we've got to look at what did actually happen. And it seems very much, John, as though you're suggesting there should be some kind of response. I wonder what you think then would be the most appropriate response from Israel next.
Well, I want to stay on this question whether there should be a response at all, because I think that inevitably colors the question how big it should be. Do you believe there's a politician in Great Britain, other than perhaps George Galloway, that if the UK were faced with some adversary firing 320 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones at the UK, whatever the casualties were afterward, that they would not insist on retaliation?
I don't want to get stuck in hypotheticals here, John. I'm asking
from
your
because
area of
that's important.
expertise.
Before we lecture Israel, shouldn't we ask ourselves, what would we do in a similar situation? Let me take it from the U.S., a non-hypothetical situation. We were attacked by Japan on December the 7th, 1941, suffered thousands of casualties, lost 5 battleships at Pearl Harbor, and enormous destruction. Now, what if the Japanese had attacked, but we were prepared to defend? We didn't lose any battleships. Pearl Harbor was not nearly destroyed. We didn't suffer thousands of casualties. Would we not have declared war on Japan anyway? Of course we would. So the whole debate about whether it was a win ignores the fact of the attack. And that has to color Israel's response, because the next time they see ballistic missiles heading toward Israel from Iran, they could have nuclear warheads under their nose cones.
So, John, your former area of expertise, National Security Advisor to Donald Trump. If you were currently advising the US president about what they should be saying to Israel and what they think the response should be, what would you be saying?
I would say that there has to be a very substantial response on the territory of Iran, because what Iran did was attack Israel's territory from its own territory. That's as classic a definition of an act of war as you can get. and that the Israelis could look at a range of things, all of which I would find acceptable. Certainly, the first thing they should do is flatten as much of Iran's air defense capabilities as they can to make sure more of their missiles get through and their pilots over Iran are safe. Second, they should destroy all of the bases that from which the attacks on Saturday night were launched, including any arsenals of drones and missiles that might be found at those bases. They could consider attacking headquarters of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and conventional military who ordered the attacks. I think they could consider destroying substantial parts of Iran's oil infrastructure. And I think whether they launch a kinetic attack against Iran's nuclear program or perhaps just the mother of all cyber attacks against it, they should go after the nuclear program too.
What involvement would that involve from the US and the UK in terms of them saying, look, we'll support one of our allies in Israel? It sounds as though, John, you're suggesting something that would be an escalation of the current environment.
Look, the escalation began on October the 7th. That's like saying, let me come back to Pearl Harbor. My goodness, you'd consider war across the Pacific? That's an escalation. That's really terrible, isn't it? If you're entitled to act in self-defense, it's not an escalation to defend yourself. If that's the argument, then there's no point in having a military at all, because heaven forbid anybody would escalate. The fact is the regime in Iran is the biggest threat to peace and security in the Middle East today, bar none. If it weren't for Iran arming, equipping, training, and financing Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, the Iraqi Shia militia groups, we wouldn't be in the war we're in now. Iran is the source of the conflict.